I'd like to just open it up if anyone has any comments, questions, or anything else.
Julian?
Hi, Julie.
Hi. My experience, when I share, it's a warmth in my heart and a connection with that person, and it's just energy. Like you use the example of opening the door for someone, it's just a heart-to-heart connection.
So it's kind of interesting if we think about, you have these philosophical debates from ancient times, are humans good or bad, that kind of, those type of topics, right? But this altruism, as it's labeled, right, it's now been demonstrated repeatedly, even among animals. We know from experience, I don't care what, people with, have their perhaps very narrowly focused PhDs in, say, well, we don't know, but, we know through our experience, and as the Grandmaster was just explaining, the feeling we get that this is clearly part of our nature. And so some people have talked about the self and think about the self in very myopic terms, right? But what we see through these altruistic, what can be labeled altruistic acts, right, is that we actually sense the self as much greater than just the atomistic, this is just me, or this is just me and my family, right? And that's where one could say it is life speaking to other life, right? We're ignorant up here, right? Intellectually, but it's life speaking to other life. And that life which, it happens on our bodies, right? They're serving, the cells serve each other and serve the organs, and the organs serve the whole body, without reflection. And it's just, the way of life and nature that perhaps, we've allowed ourselves to some degree to doubt it or to question it, because we've kind of taken it into academia and said, well, let's, prove it. But we see it in our own very natures. And there's it's an important thing for all of us to water that part of ourselves.
Hi, I wanted to comment. I am now serving as a sort of a coordinator for a local group, and that is a physical thing, but I have found that in order to do that, I've had to really go inward and grow to help the group grow, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. This is where the interesting about affiliated bodies, right? That's where we kind of made that commitment, right? We said we're going to take on a role, we're going to help this because we know it's a great purpose that it serves. And yes, we kind of find out some of our own shortcomings, our own little weaknesses. But we're in family, they kind of just, okay, you just, slam the door and walk out. Or at work, where actually you got to hide that stuff because people, can't slam the door and walk out and come back. But, when we're in service within affiliated bodies, we can really be called upon and realize, oh, okay, how do I work with this stuff inside of myself? And as Troy, you point out, by doing it, we can reach those other parts in other people, right? That same goodness and that same, if you can get to a soul-to-soul conversation, which was not easy to do, but if you take yourself there, it kind of removes our own defensiveness, and how we address those things, we address differently because we're coming from that place deeper inside ourselves, trying to, if we recognize the God consciousness in someone else, it changes how we react in that setting, and it changes how they react. Is it Frater Glenn who was speaking?
Yes, I'm retired, and so I'm also a peer counselor as a volunteer. But something I've discovered from a mystical point of view is it allows for the opening of compassion and the experience of compassion. And that in itself, when I take it internally, as Julie was talking about that warm feeling, but it also brings on a form of catharsis, okay, to help you with your self-perception. And when you break down your self-perception to a wider field through compassion, you discover the universality of the family we call humanity. I think that's a key point and a key use for, service.
Great, thank you. That's a great contribution. Thank you. So we should all kind of take note of that, right? Because those are, again, it's, we're all working on our development, and it's kind of multifaceted, right? What we have to do with ourselves, and we're not just polishing, this over here all day, it's kind of, and where we kind of break down those things, we see and sense, I think, as the Fred was saying, the humanity in others. We realize the commonality. I look at it, where I'm at, I encounter a bunch of ants on occasion, and I'm like, this ant, as the ant sees me, thinking, you don't belong here, or I'd like you outside, please. But then the ant is just trying to make it. It's hiding, it's doing all this stuff just to survive. And, we have that in common. It's, we have that, and that's true with, if we can get by the outer, we realize, wow, and it is one beautiful life. If we can go inside and just get to that beautiful life, and then beauty would come out, because we act beautiful when we're coming from that. Someone had mentioned a point around the ego, and from my vantage point, I would say the ego only recognizes the material self, and that it therefore does whatever it can to protect the material self, which is a fairly narrow-minded view, and in that way it winds up, it can wind up in opposition to the spiritual development we need to do, which is to take ourselves beyond this, the individual personality, and to recognize others and so on. So I never look at these things, even the ego is a part of God, right? It's part of the God creation. So there's nothing bad, but it's like, I think what we know with the law of harmony is things being in the place where they belong, right? So there's a place for everything. It has a certain place, but at a certain point though, that, as they say in the Kabbalistic tradition, the pillars dance. That which is good then can become evil, right? It's because it's setting in its context, where is it appropriate? And the ego does tend to have a preoccupation with the physical material stuff, because it doesn't realize the eternal, immortal aspect of ourselves. So, it's doing like the ant is trying to do, get away and fight, protect itself. Ant doesn't likely realize it's immortal either.
Thanks, Brother Julian. That was rather great. I just wanted to add that there is a great piece of mythology work, the 12 labors of Hercules. And if I remember correctly, the 8th one is where Hercules is about to slay the Hydra. And this, long story short, this is something that cannot be done merely by using force or anything like that. However, Hercules relies on the advice given by the master within. And the master within advises him, we rise by kneeling, we conquer by letting go. And in many ways, this encapsulates the service analogy. Also, the Christian doctrine of service and loving thy neighbor as yourself is actually the optimal solution to what we call in science the prisoner's dilemma. And this is a rather wide topic, and I'm gonna paste it in the chat so that you can read it on your own. But practically it means that we are trapped in this material world, and because of that we often make choices that force us to be selfish and inconsiderate to others. And this brings about lots of suffering and lots of unfairness into the world. This is inbuilt into the world as it is. However, the optimal solution to this is loving thy neighbor as yourself and sharing the love with everyone around you so that you can escape the penalty of the prisoner's dilemma. I'll share it in the chat right away. Thanks once again.
Thank you, Frater. Thank you. You know, that's, so if you, the love thy neighbor as thyself, people sometimes look at it as simply altruistic, but of course we also know from the mystical point of view, as you get to the root, right, we realize there is only one soul. We're different expressions of that soul, and that we really have that oneness. And I like the example, the prisoner's dilemma there, because right, if you come from that point of view, you kind of address the dilemma. But it is not the, if we only understand ourselves as our material self, we get lost. You know.
Julian?
Yes.
I'd like to thank you for your presentations, in depth, a lot to chew on. Really appreciate that. Yeah. Recently, Letitia and I have had a chance to join the Grand Master as part of a team for fraters and sorors passing through transition and new babies born.
Mm.
It is so phenomenal. I don't know who's getting the most benefit, those going through transition or us. The whole process of looking at death is differently. You know, you get the service and you really feel it. It's just absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. That's thank you for that example, because it is helpful for all of us to realize, I'm going to say how practical, you know, this is tangible, practical stuff. It's just we haven't been trained and educated to recognize that, you know, these laws and principles are as real and material, physical as, you know, gravity. And doing the work you're describing, when we do this work, right, you know, it comes right through you and you get the benefit of it. And so, and that's wonderful work. And I know there is something for people who perhaps have encountered there in our Rosicrucian studies where there's certain exercise or practice that one would perform to aid someone going through transition. And we know that we can do that just through our thoughts and visualization and directing these energies, even, you know, until you perhaps get to that particular exercise. So thank you for sharing that. There's something also,
hey, Frater,
go ahead, please.
Frater Julian, first of all, thank you very much for your service. The way that I see the service is once we appear in this dimension, in the first day of, since that instant of the time to the last instant of our life here, everything and every around us is in our service. If our body is in our service, then once we understand that everything around is in our service, immediately inside of us exists like the consciousness to serve constantly to all of us around. Then it's like you mentioned, it's an interaction. Once you start the conscious of the service in your life, you live for service, because otherwise you don't be part of the systems of the creation. This is how I see that. Thank you very much.
Frater, thank you for mentioning that. It's interesting, right? We all, you know, this notion that basically everything is in service, the whole thing, at least one of the points I took in your comment there. So we know sometimes when we meet people, right, and we have, you know, some oppositional challenge with the person or the situation, right? And we're reminded sometimes, someone reminds us, well, that person is just an agent, right, for our development, right? It's not personal, they're just an agent for our development. And that, as this frater just pointed out, everything is this service, right? We're constantly being served, and we're part of service, because all of these experiences are, right, aimed toward that evolution of our consciousness. And so here we are, that all these experiences, and when we in fact, I really appreciate your bringing that out, because when it kind of infuses then, and we can recognize that infusion in all of life around us, and then life is different. We see, instead of seeing it as pieces, oh, this and that, I encounter this and that, no, realize, no, this is all just this thing that really is leading to this evolution of all expression, right? The expression of soul consciousness and all the different manifestations of it. Truly, and I just love your point there that, you know, everything is in a sense in service where we encounter. So that way, nothing is wasted, clearly, right? It's that ecology, this great, you know what's so fascinating, I'm sorry, I'll turn to and say, I'm sorry, that, you know, you think of the gigantic computer it takes, right, to have all this stuff, all these events, all these people, all these circumstances, right, kind of rub on each other and touch each other for this common evolution of all the pieces within this whole, right? We think of the magnitude of that intelligence, right? It's, you know, yes, it's very impressive even, you know, you think of 100 billion galaxies with 100 billion stars in each and all the whatever, you go, wow, whatever that is. But then you think about, whoa, it can run this whole program, right? Where everything is in service, right? Everything we encounter, we're serving a part of somebody else's growth, they're serving a part of our growth. You know, the cat that we cohabitat with, and this one and that one, all of us, that's a pretty amazing story, Frater, and I appreciate you for sharing that. Thank you.
For me, service is the law of nature. Because if each one of us was really serving one another, we wouldn't have no poverty in this world. So when we look at one another, that selfishness really stops us from serving each other, as far as serving with our time, talent, and treasure, whatever we are blessed with. We are calling this earth to service. So some of us don't really go out of their way to service one another. And that's what service is all for me. By helping one another, by helping somebody I see that's needing help, by doing good deed, you know, by not feeling good about myself when I'm helping somebody. Because sometimes people think service, you're gonna feel good. You're not gonna feel really, really good if you're helping, if you're going out of your way. Really, if you're lending somebody a hand, service is going beyond yourself to help somebody else. That's how I see service.
Saroy, you know, you make an interesting point there also that I want to kind of embellish a little bit. So, you know, you can look at the self, right? So very often what people call good and evil, one could also look at through the lens of how the self is perceived. So when the self is perceived as just the individual, what I would call atomistic, A-T-O-M, you know, it's like, oh, this is me. And so I do things. An example that comes to my mind very often thinking about this is if I go out and steal something from someone else because it's going to benefit me, aggrandize me in some fashion, benefit me, right? People go, evil, bad guy, right? Now, if I go out, let's say that I happen to be part of a family and I see them as myself, right? Because that's what happens, right? You see your spouse or your partner or your children, right, as yourself, right? And I go out and I steal, but I do it and share with my children, people go, not quite as bad a guy. Well, you know, yeah, he shouldn't have done that, but he did it for them, not bad. Okay, good. So, okay, now the self has gotten larger. The action is the same, mind you, right? But the self is a larger conception of the self. Now, certain circumstances could bring it about where I might see my community, village, town, whatever it is, my community as self. I go and steal from the next guy. I come back, I share with the community, and I'd like to say they slay a goat for me, right? They go, hey, good guy, you know, he did it for the community. Okay, I now maybe see the nation as my self, right? And I go out and I do some not very kind things to some other humans, right, on behalf of my nation. And instead of them going, let me lock him up, they actually give me a statue in the park, right? And what we have here in all of these, and then of course, eventually, now as you see the self getting larger and larger, right, you take care of the self. At a certain point, when you see your neighbor as yourself, right, you won't do anything harmful to them because you see them as yourself. You have that same love, right? That love extends to them. When you see all the humanity as yourself, right, we see it as we move toward that, right? We see our actions because we see that oneness. And then you get to the, you know, Gandhi, Jesus, you know, avatars, kind of, they realize all living things as the self. So truly loving thy neighbor, love thy neighbor as thyself, right, is because you recognize that oneness. And that's clearly a soul to soul communication, right, where there is that oneness and not the material self, which is just me and, you know, me and people who look like me, or me and people who come from where I come from, or whatever the case may be. So partly, I think, Soror, what drives a lot of what you're pointing out is people's sense of self is very atomistic still, right? Now, sometimes circumstances will open it up. You know, there's an earthquake, there's a this, there's a that. You know, I'm from New York, live in New York, and people say, oh, New Yorkers are so whatever. But, you know, in a crisis, the barriers melt, right? We kind of embrace and whatever else, you know, we almost seem like we're from the South. We're so nice. But I think the point you make about people, they're just right. They're very atomistic. And that's likely just that objective consciousness is dominating so much. But let's say that when the work that we do and that the Imperator asks us to do, where we're sending out this light to Earth, et cetera, are we helping to ever so slightly, again, fertilize and put some water and little sunshine on that aspect of humanity, right? Because that's the solution, right? Unless we know kind of the God within us, we're going to act pretty badly towards other interest. And that's how we may be able to help those individuals, because you can't help them necessarily up here. You got to kind of go behind, inside, kind of come in the back door, you know, where, and that stuff works. You know, if you're in a situation where you need to address that with somebody, right? You're having a problem, then, you know, you kind of get to that soul to soul thing offline, and, you know, you'll be like, my God, what happened to him overnight, right? Well, you know, the stuff works. So, but thank you, Soror, also for that, that comment there.
I'd like to ask you something, but I don't know just exactly how to say it, because it's like when you get to the stage of service, this is what matters, and that's how you operate. Well, sometimes I get a flow of what to say, and it comes in like magic. It doesn't come from like my brain. It couldn't possibly. It just happens to help. Now, that's when it feels good. But sometimes there's a situation where either someone asks you something and you're speechless because your speech is taken away from you because you might say something wrong just because you didn't like being on the spot. Or let's say it might be even saying something, some words come through you that are actually quite not very nice, or, you know, telling them, you know, and that's hard to take sometimes when you have to say something that needs to be said, even though you might be praised for it afterwards by somebody saying like, well, you really got it there, because no one ever told me that. But sometimes, you know, that I struggle with that sometimes.
So I think you have to trust your intuition. I mean, I think that really, because, you know, when you, and it sounds like from what you're describing, there are times that you say where things come through, you know, the right understanding comes through, and it's not one that you've necessarily kind of put together intellectually, but it just kind of comes through. So it seemed to me you're kind of likely, you know, your radio is pretty well tuned there a bit, right? You know, you're not, you know, you don't have
Yes.
to be exactly on the station, but you're pretty much, you know, tuned in, even if you get a little static. That, you know, you really have to, because you can use your intellect to talk you out of communicating that point, right?
Yes.
Because, well, I think what I'd be looking for is what are the best words I can put it in, but it's likely important to say, right? But what are the best words I can put it in that you know, that make sure that people don't sense an animus there, but it may be something very valuable for that person to hear as you know. Okay, Founder, please.
I have a question.
Please.
In service, what might forgiveness have to do in our giving of service?
Founder, would you mind elaborating further on that? That's a quite interesting topic, at least, that you bring up there. Founder, you're on mute. We need to unmute.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes, I have been thinking about forgiveness in relation to service, how they may be connected. And I think it has a lot to do with your personal service, you know, service to one's own self. And it's not often talked about.
Founder, would you mind just elaborating? Share your thoughts with us, please.
Yes. For example, the Master Jesus said, if we are going to be serving God, we first have to make sure that we are right with our neighbor. If you have something against someone, you make right to that person before you go trying to make right with God. And this is for your own benefit, not for the benefit of the person. So here, personal service is important. I don't hear this much mentioned much, because we have to serve with a good conscience. We have to be able to serve with less of a burden upon ourselves, you might say, freely serving, that is. And I think that's where the happiness comes in.
Founder, that's a,
yes.
a wonderful point, because it cuts across in many different ways, right? You can have what was mentioned in the discourse. You can get where people kind of have a superiority, sense of superiority in service, which
yes.
obviously, you know, I guess if you're there at the food kitchen, you're getting the food, you're happy no matter what attitude they have, but they likely are not getting the full benefit of service, as you're pointing out, right?
Yes.
They think they are, I'm serving, but actually no, it's actually serving more perhaps the false sense of superiority rather than getting the spiritual growth that could come out of it. So that's a really good point. And undoubtedly, you know, you likely people, you look for where are those pressure points in one's life, right? Where, you know, a phrase that guides me, has guided me most of my time is I say, wherever the pain is, usually is where the problem is. You know, wherever I'm feeling that rub, that's my issue, right? I got an issue in there, right? It's my issue. The other person is just kind of bringing it. So they have to bring mine. It wouldn't be an issue if I got an issue, right? So sometimes, yes, those two can be disconnected for people. But you know, I look at this as all an iterative process, right? It's an iterative. This example of a lapidary tumbler, with how you polish jewels, stones. I mean, maybe that's not how they do it nowadays, but you know, it's a tumbler. You put a bunch of precious stones in. They're kind of rough still. You put some grit in, and then you put a little, I'm going to say water, but I'm sure there's some $10,000 an ounce fluid they actually use nowadays, right? And you seal it up, and it turns very slowly, 24 hours a day for a month. Then after a month, you open it up, you kind of pour the water out, you change the grain, the grit. Any stones that are still very rough, you take those out, and then you leave the other ones and you put finer grit in, right? And another fluid, and you close that back up and let it turn again, right? and they're rubbing on each other, and that's how they're being polished, right? So I look at that as, to me, the analogy there, or the metaphor, I'm not sure which one it is, but you know, where the stones, where the stones, the grit of the circumstances, you know, and the lubricant kind of is what happens. And so it could be that one day that person is that soup kitchen who's actually, though, down there with perhaps an attitude of superiority. I'm just using that as an example, right? Okay, well, you know, and they haven't, there's something in them says, gee, I should be doing something good, but it's conflated, right, with other baggage. And very often, you know, life's going to bring something along, hopefully sooner for them, that will pull that apart for them, right? And they'll see, hold it. You know, I've been going there, and I've got, it's not what I hoped it would be. And you can see that in society writ large, right? You get this conflation very often, and that service can be patronizing or condescending, sometimes mixed in, which is not as fruitful.
Thank you, Father Julian.
Thank you for bringing that out.
Yeah.
I think service is a way of giving back for the love that we've been given when we come into our incarnation.
And Sorora, you're pointing out, well, you know, it's interesting because I guess a little bit what you're, and since it's so innate, it could just be called giving, right? Somebody put it like the sun, you know, shines, right? You know, it's that it just shines, right? And you, perhaps in this incarnation, you were drawn to give, right? Because you hadn't, you know, you just got here from early life, perhaps. But thank you. Did you want to say something?
I just wanted to talk about a couple of experiences I had. I'll just kind of lump them together, but it was really profound for me. I was in several situations where it was extremely dangerous, not just for me, but for another person. And something just came through me. I felt like I just felt this compassion for the people, and it instantly transformed all of us. And it was miraculous. The change in the circumstances became very positive.
Sorora, thank you for giving that example, and for the other folks who are on this call, it's a wonderful illustration if one hasn't had that type of experience oneself at this point, or circumstances haven't you know, brought that about, to, if you kind of go down into these soul levels, there's a communication that takes place that is not the objective consciousness of people, right? You go into those levels there, there's something transformative. And this is why, you know, consciousness is the alchemy, right? Consciousness is the alchemy. So whatever's simulated to have that particular experience at that moment, you tune into that stuff. It's like, you're right, you're like, this is like magic. You know, it's like kind of crazy, but it works. And so thank you for sharing that. It truly is, you know, it's unbelievable, except that, you know, you have these experiences and you can see that they happen systematically under certain circumstances, or you bring them about because you see they're needed in a circumstance. So there's a wonderful phrase, and I believe it may come out of the Martinist tradition. It's called the alchemy of illumined thought, right? That alchemy of illumined thought. It's amazing what it produces. So we want to make sure to take advantage of that when we're doing our spiritual work, right? We're in our sanctums, right? Where we're, you know, going down into these various thoughts, because that creates a certain environment, then that also enriches us. Or when we're doing work in you know, in convocations or, you know, affiliated bodies, right? You go to those places, and if you're ever serving as an officer on a ritualistic team, as an example, right? You want to go into those places where you can generate that, right? Generate that for the benefit of the group, right? And you too benefit, right? I mean, you become the conveyor of it. It just kind of, you know, it's a win, win, win. But thank you beautiful to see that, you know, that stuff works and use it and have it available. So the promises that are made, matter of fact, I say, if you go back to the mandamises, you know, those initial monographs we get when we first join the order, and you read those, I think there's 6 or 8 of them. You read them, and, you know, when you read them 20 years later or so, or whatever, you go, they actually said that in there. So, you know, and at the time you read it, we're like, oh, you know, what is that? Right, what is actually true? So the example you gave, you likely could find a reference in the mandamises, you know, saying, here's what you know, be able to do. You're like, really? But, you know, all this stuff has to be in alignment, as the other Fad was talking about, where, you know, you kind of have your inner stuff also kind of in alignment. The beauty, and I'll just close it, I don't want to run us all over in terms of your time. The beauty of this, though, is you don't have to be exactly spot on 98.6 on the frequency, on the radio. It actually has, you know, it recognizes we're human. So, you know, you kind of hang around, you know, plus or minus 5 on the, you know, on the radio dial there. You can tune in, the stuff tunes in, right? It really does tune in. Undoubtedly, the finer we all can kind of get to, you just get much more energy that comes through, right? But the beauty, even for our mundane lives, you know, you can kind of be within the zone. There's, you know, 1 standard deviation from the mean somewhat, or at least a half a standard deviation from the mean. And you see, oh, this stuff works pretty consistently and well. And it has some fault tolerance for us, thank God, right? But Louis Cletus de Montaigne also said, I'm paraphrasing ever so slightly, I'm leaving out a little half a phrase, but he said, and pardon the gendered reference here, but he said, well, humankind is a thought of God. How could he but not love his own thought? Right? So there's some slack. So anyway, well, thank you all for being part of this and contributing and inspiring, leaving me walking away more inspired than I came to this, you know, an hour and a half or 40 minutes ago. God bless, obviously, to all of us. And let's try to remember, you know, don't, you know, come back from the illusion periodically, right? And remember, when we come back from it, that's the actual stuff.